Hello friends, imagine this. You are on a short flight with your teammates and family, heading to a neighboring country for a simple rugby match. The journey is supposed to take only 3 hours. The weather is a little rough, but you are not worried. After all, you trust the pilots, you trust the aircraft, and you are sitting among friends, joking and laughing. But what if this flight turns into a nightmare that will push you beyond the limits of human survival? This is the mystery and the miracle of Flight 571. It was the 12th of October, 1972, when a small chartered aircraft took off from Uruguay, bound for Santiago, the capital of Chile. On board were 45 people, mostly young rugby players, tall, strong, and full of energy. Alongside them were family members and friends, excited for the journey. The flight should have been quick, but between Uruguay and Chile lies a deadly obstacle: the mighty Andes. The Andes Mountains stretch endlessly across South America. They are the longest mountain range in the world, and home to peaks that rise higher than almost anywhere else, second only to the Himalayas. Beautiful, yes, but on that day, they became a death trap. The weather was bad. Clouds and storms surrounded the aircraft, and the pilots were forced to make an emergency stop in Mendoza, Argentina, for the night. The next day, October 13th, they took off again at 2:18 p.m. The skies were clearer, and the passengers relaxed. An hour passed smoothly. Then at 3:21 p.m., while descending towards Santiago, turbulence hit. The aircraft shook violently. Outside the windows, only thick white clouds were visible. The alarms began to scream. The pilots desperately tried to control the plane. Suddenly, the clouds cleared for a moment, and a horrifying sight appeared: a mountain peak, dangerously close. The pilots pulled the aircraft upwards with all their strength. The engines roared as they fought to gain altitude. For a moment, it looked like they might succeed. But fate had other plans. The rear of the aircraft clipped the mountain. The tail section ripped away, taking to rows of seats and 3 passengers with it, who vanished into the sky. The plane shook violently, parts breaking apart midair. The left wing was torn away. More passengers were thrown out into the icy void. Finally, only the battered front fuselage remained. It crashed down onto a glacier, skidding 700 meters at terrifying speed before coming to a halt. The pilots were killed instantly. The cockpit was crushed. The fuselage lay shattered on an unknown mountainside, more than 3,500 meters above sea level. Out of 45 on board, 33 were alive. Somehow, they had survived the crash, but this was only the beginning of their nightmare. Many were badly injured. The cold was bone-freezing. They were far from their planned route, 80 kilometers off course, in the middle of nowhere. No one knew where they were. Two survivors, 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino, were medical students. In the chaos, they became doctors. They moved quickly, tending to wounds, trying to keep people alive. Among the injured was 23-year-old Fernando Parado, unconscious with a fractured skull. For now, his fate seemed sealed. Meanwhile, search operations began. Within hours of the crash, Chilean air rescue had aircraft scanning the mountains. But from above, the white fuselage was invisible against the endless snow. Even when planes passed directly overhead, the survivors' desperate screams were swallowed by the wind. At night, as temperatures plunged below freezing, hope kept them alive. But 5 of the injured never made it through the first night. The number of survivors dropped to 28. Still, the group fought to live. They turned the fuselage into a shelter, sealing the open rear with snow, luggage, and seat cushions. They melted snow on metal sheets to make water. They used seat cushions as snowshoes and stuffing from the seats to keep warm. Parado, miraculously, woke from his coma 3 days later, only to discover his mother had died in the crash and his younger sister was fatally injured. Despite his desperate attempts, she too died after 8 days. The search continued for a week, with aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. But after 142 hours of searching, with no trace found, the rescue was called off. The world believed everyone on board Flight 571 was dead. The survivors learned this when they discovered a small transistor radio in the wreckage. At first, hope soared. With some improvisation, they managed to power it. But instead of rescue, they heard the devastating news the search had been abandoned. Tears flowed. Some prayed, some gave up, but for Parado and Canessa, a fire was lit. If help would not come to them, they would have to go and find it. By the 11th day, there was another terrifying problem. The food was gone. All they had started with were a few chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, some jam, peanuts, dates, candies, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine. Even rationed, it quickly ran out. Hunger gnawed at their bodies. Some tried chewing on cotton from the seats or leather straps, but it only made them sick. Finally, with death closing in, a decision was made, one that shocked the world when it was revealed. To survive, they would eat the only food left, the frozen bodies of their dead friends. This decision broke them emotionally. These were not strangers. They were teammates, classmates, siblings. But survival left no choice. Canessa was the first to try. Others followed, hesitantly, some resisted for days, but eventually, every survivor understood it was either this or death. And friends, before we continue, I want to pause here. Stories like these remind us how fragile life is, how unpredictable. These people never imagined their flight would turn into one of the greatest survival stories in history. Just like them, none of us know what tomorrow brings. That's why I make these videos, so that you and I can learn, grow, and be reminded of the value of every moment. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe right now. I promise you, the stories ahead will change the way you look at life itself. Days stretched into weeks, the survivors grew weaker, but their will to live burned brighter. On the 16th day, disaster struck again. An avalanche thundered down the mountain, burying the fuselage in snow. 8 more died, suffocated in the icy tomb. Only 19 remained. For days they lived trapped beneath the snow, fighting to breathe through small air holes they carved with metal poles. When at last they dug their way out, a snowstorm forced them back into the cramped snow cave. Yet still, they endured. By now, it was clear no one was coming. The only chance was to leave the mountains, but how? The nearest civilization was far beyond what they imagined. Still, 3 of the strongest survivors, Canessa, Parado, and Antonio Vizintin, decided to try. They would carry food, wear the warmest clothes, and set out on foot. They believed Chile lay just a few kilometers west. They were wrong. The crash site was 89 kilometers deep inside the Andes, but they did not know this. On November 15, 33 days after the crash, the 3 men began their journey. Climbing through snow, exhausted and starving, they stumbled upon the rear section of the plane. Inside, they found a treasure suitcases filled with food, rum, extra clothes, and even a radio. For a moment, hope returned, but the radio would not work. The batteries were incompatible. Days of effort were wasted. Finally, they accepted the truth. They would have to keep walking. As if the mountains had not punished them enough, another avalanche struck in December, killing 3 more survivors. Only 16 remained. In desperation, one young survivor, Carlos Rodriguez, used his mother's sewing lessons to stitch together scraps of clothing into a giant sleeping bag. This invention would save lives. On December 12th, exactly 2 months after the crash, Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin set off again, this time determined not to stop until they found help. They climbed glaciers without ropes, compasses, or experience, wearing layers of jeans, sweaters, and plastic bags on their feet. The air grew thinner, their bodies weaker. At night, they huddled together in their homemade sleeping bag, shivering, waiting for dawn. For 3 days they climbed. On the 4th, Vizintin returned to the fuselage to conserve food, leaving Parado and Canessa alone. When they reached the mountain peak, they hoped to see green valleys. Instead, all around them stretched an endless ocean of white mountains, jagged and merciless. Still, they refused to turn back. They marched on. After 9 excruciating days, frostbitten, starving, and delirious, They stumbled into a valley where a river flowed. And then a miracle, on the far side of the river, they saw horses. And then three men, farmers, for the first time in 72 days, they had found signs of life. They screamed, but the roaring river drowned their voices. By sheer luck, one farmer noticed. He could not cross, but he threw them a pencil and paper tied to a stone. Parada wrote the words that would end their nightmare. I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am from Uruguay. We have been walking for 10 days. My friends are injured at the crash site. We need help. The farmer, Sergio Catalan, read the note and immediately set off. For 10 hours he rode his horse through valleys to reach the army. The next day, helicopters flew into the Andes. Guided by Parado himself, they located the crash site. On December 22nd, 70 days after the crash, the miracle of the Andes was complete. 16 survivors were lifted from the frozen mountains. They were malnourished, frostbitten, and broken, but alive. The world watched in disbelief. Against all odds, against every law of nature, they had endured. This story is not just about survival, it is about the power of hope. About refusing to give up even when the world has abandoned you. About courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit. Flight 571 is remembered as one of history's greatest miracles because in the face of death, they chose life. Now, my friends, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in their place? Could you have made the same impossible choices? Share your thoughts in the comments because this story deserves to be discussed, remembered, and honored forever.